Coming up, the founder of the American West that you've never heard of, right here on Reckoning with Jason Herbert. My name is Jason Herbert. I'm a Southerner who lives in the West. I'm a historian, an outdoorsman, and a movie buff. I like finding new answers to old questions, and this is a reckoning. You and I actually met in Florida.
That's right.
You know, yeah, and of all places, ethnohistory back in when I first actually came on board with the Forest Service back in 2023, they sent me right back to Tally just almost immediately. And then I bumped into you. I was like, "What's this dude doing Ute history out here and stuff?" And that was, and I got to. The cool thing is, I'm thinking about this. I was reading your book, was thinking about talking to you as you were kind of putting the finishing touches on this thing and really kind of coming to a, to it, and then seeing to fruition. It's like it felt almost like when I would hear about a movie getting signed, and then 2 years later you're watching it at the theater. It's like
that's yes. And folks hearing this, I'm happy to take pitches for movies. I mean, it's a very cinematic.
It does feel like a movie when you read the book.
It's I'll just the first book I wrote is a very academic book on similar topics, though from a different perspective. The next book, I imagine, maybe we could talk about this at the end, is even more cinematic. But yeah, I mean, you and I was complaining at ethnohistory, or complaining. Yeah, maybe that's the right word, though it's not really my story to complain about the fact that Wakara, and that's the subject of our conversation. I'll just introduce it myself here.
Wakara, go for it.
America, the life and legacy of a founder of the American West. And it's a story about this Ute leader from the 1840s, who I argue is really a fundamental figure in the founding of the American West, and is a really important defender of Native sovereignty. I opened the book with another one of his fellow Ute leaders, Ute as in Utah, right?
Mm-hmm.
The tribe after which the state is named, looking down at his gravesite, Wakara's gravesite, after it had been pillaged, stolen by agents of the federal government, and tracing that, right, kind of the kind of suspending a little bit for readers to keep on going, right? You don't want to give away everything. Is the mystery of why and how is not really that mysterious, but the why of Wakara's grave robbing happened, and why the federal government in particular was interested in removing these native remains as part of its project of what it saw as ultimate conquering of the West, the completion of the manifest destiny. So and Wakara's remains are still in, and the 6 other people he was buried with are still boxed up somewhere in the Smithsonian's holdings. So that's a story that will still continue to unfold.
Yeah, we're definitely going to talk about the ideas of trying to bring ancestors home. I certainly before I came to work for the Forest Service, I worked for the Seminole Tribe of Florida real closely with their TIPO office, and got to see a lot of their work as far as like trying to bring people home. Certainly with the tribes that I work with now, it's a big component of the stuff that they do. So I definitely want to get into a lot of that. And you're absolutely right. This book opens up. I felt, opens up like a film in so many different ways. It's like, but before we get into that, let's get into you, Max. Like, you want to introduce yourself and tell us like who you are, like what you're doing here?
Yeah, terrific. So Max Perry Mueller. I go with the mixture, include the Perry. For religious studies people, this is a tangent on a tangent, but religious studies people, Friedrich Max Mueller was a famous kind of founder of the field. He wrote this book called The Scientific Study of Religion in the 19th century, the late 19th century. So it's kind of a joke. Oh, Max Mueller doing religious studies. So I insist on the Max Perry Mueller, and also in honor of my matrilineal lines here. So I'm an associate professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. As we were saying before, Huskerland, and I study race and religion mostly in the American West. And my goal is what I'm really interested in is origin stories.
Yeah.
And both origin stories of races, of nations, of religions. And so this book about Wakara emerges out of a research I did for my first book that was based on my Harvard dissertation, which I published through UNC Press, University of North Carolina Press, in 2017, called Race in the Making of the Mormon People. And I was really interested in how America in the early 19th century was trying to figure out its origin stories, right? It was telling its origin stories, one that was religious and racial, and how the Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, understood race as part of one of the schisms that they were trying to overcome, right? Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, saw his work as ending schisms, political, religious, and as particularly racial. So in that first project, I was looking at how early Mormons conceptualized race as a category of human division, but also specifically in the American context as race as understood as kind of Native American, red, the original races, red, black, and white. And Wakara was a really important figure in that first project. And when the Latter-day Saints get to Utah in 1847, as they're fleeing kind of the United States, actually, they encounter this figure, Wakara, who's the most powerful man in the Great Basin, and I would argue in the American Southwest. And they eventually partner with him. They sometimes partner, sometimes fight against him for the next 7 years before he dies in somewhat mysterious circumstances. And that first project was about how the Mormons viewed him, used him, what I call a paper Indian, how they wrote about him on the page, both sometimes as a friend, sometimes as a foe, and then enacted their policies on flesh and bone bodies of Native Americans, especially him. Well, in this book, I'm trying to turn that perspective around, right, and tell Wakara's story, and not just how he saw the Mormons, but how he saw the world, and how he saw the America, the political, cultural project that he helped create, emerge during the 1840s and 1850s. So that's kind of the origin story of this project.
Okay, so I'm absolutely fascinated with this on so many different levels. I think you know this certainly. I think a lot of my listeners know I work closely with two of the Ute tribes in my day-to-day job. The two tribes that are here in Colorado, Southern Ute Indian Tribe, and then the Ute Mountain Ute Tribe as well. This Wakara belongs. The wording here is to. Well, he's an ancestor of people who live now in the Ute tribe in Utah.
Yeah, Ute Indian Tribe of Utah is the official federal recognized name.
Yes, and I do not want Betsy yelling at me on this. So I saw her recently. But also, this is so important on so many different levels, Max. For my own work, I kept flashing back and forth between what was going on in Florida at the time, for my own work during the Seminole Wars and so forth. There's some real similarities between Wakara and Osceola as far as what happens with them. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. I see all of a sudden I'm reading your book and I'm like, hey, they're in this book, which I was like, hey, all right, Max. But then also it's so important, with the stuff that I do with film. And, we're seeing these things on Ken Burn. The Ken Burn series is on right now as we're recording this. And there's so much here at stake when we're talking about how we remember who we are, create these own origin stories about ourselves. There's a young George Washington film coming out next year that's going to be, well, we'll have a lot to say about that, I'm sure, right? So it's all of these things are really at play with one another. But I guess the question I've got for you first and foremost is, why Wakara? Because I had never heard of this cat before bumping into you a few years ago. I was certainly not a Ute specialist, but I knew some, I knew Ure, right? And I knew Chipeta. And, I knew a few folks, but this was a dude who was completely off my radar. And then as I learned more and more, and then I read from him, I'm like, where has this guy been in my story? So why Wakara of all people? Why this guy?
Well, I mean, he is just on his own so important. I mean, that's one of them. You know, the fact that you don't know him is part of the argument I'm making, right? He was a living legend during his lifetime, and I use those words advisedly. In the 1840s, really emerges. So, let me tell you a little bit about Wakara.
Please.
So he was a member of the Timpanogos band of the Utes from Utah, which their homeland, and this is really part of the story, is around Utah Lake, where Provo is now. The richest place in terms of natural resources, the most water, the most fish, the most game, the most grass, the most fresh water in the Great Basin. It's the third largest body of fresh water west of the Mississippi. So his people that was their homeland in and around that lake. He has a schism. There's a schism, and this is part of trying to figure out to whom does he belong. There was a schism during his father's life when he split from the Timpanogos, and he actually was born in what is now Spanish Fork, named after Dominguez and Escalante, who were the first European explorers of the Great Basin, Central Great Basin. And he quickly emerges within his early teens as a very prolific, and then he becomes the most prolific horse thief, along what is now called the Old Spanish Trail, which was really a Ute trail, right? A Ute trail connecting New Mexico, the outposts in New Mexico, where the Utes had been trading and raiding for a century, and then crossed the rest of the Great Basin towards California. And so he emerges as the greatest horse thief of that period. And starting in 1840 is the first time we really could locate him as a horse raider. And he, along with others, including famous mountain men like Peg Leg Smith and Jim Beckworth, are raiding horses by the thousands in California. They're going and attacking the rancheros, the secularized missions in California in the fall and winter, and they're bringing home horses by the thousands, and they're running along the Old Spanish Trail, and to supply horses, especially in New Mexico, where they couldn't hold on to herds. So he's the greatest horse thief. He also becomes the greatest, probably most prolific enslaver of other Native Americans, especially Paiutes, who are his Numic language kin, right? Shoshonean language kin. On the way to and from California, he enslaves Paiutes, pedestrian Paiutes who didn't have as many resources, couldn't defend themselves against these raiders. He also is a prolific cartographer. Anyone you can imagine in the 1840s who's crossing the Great Basin to map things, especially John C. Fremont, runs into him, and he helps them because he's the most well-traveled man in the West. Write the map, design the maps, imagine the maps. He describes the best watering holes and the best mountain passes of the Great Basin. And they take those notes and bring them back to Washington, D.C., and they print the maps that later pioneers, including the Latter-day Saints, used those very maps to get to Utah. His raiding was so important in California that, like the Comanche in Texas, the raiding softened up California. So when the Mexican-American War started, John C. Fremont, ironically, was able to march in with less resistance than he would have. So he's supplying, I say, the horse and human power of the American West in the 1840s, even before the Latter-day Saints get there. So, and then that starts a whole another kind of chapter in his history. So, people, in the 1840s, people in newspapers, mostly in the East, are seeing his name and knowing his story. He's a key figure in the drama of the creation of the American West. That's part of it. But he doesn't fit in with our narrative story. He doesn't fit with our origin story, because he's Native American. So I argue, and I try to prove through the book, the systematic erasure of him. And we started with his skulls, erasure of him and his people. Unsuccessful erasure of him since he died in 1855.
Yeah, and you brought up a really good word here, which is and as people here, because I feel like, living here in Colorado, certainly I know Ute folks and I'm friends with spend a lot of time on the res. You'll see a lot of Ute stuff around here, as well as Cheyenne, Arapaho, Comanche, Kiowa, some of the other tribes I work with. But I don't feel, Max, that the Utes are maybe as well known as maybe by non-natives outside the Great Basin, outside the Rocky, mountain area. Can we talk a little bit about who the Utes of the 19th century are in your book, but also today? Because a very important part of this that I love that you're doing here is reinforcing Ute continuity through your work and through the relationships you've got. So can we talk about, I guess, maybe the Ute people, Ute culture writ large?
Yeah. So I mostly, as you point out, that I mostly focus on what we'll kind of generally call the Western Utes, right?
Yes.
Which are the Utah Utes.
Yes.
And the Utah Utes were the most dominant people of the Great Basin, especially what is now Utah. The bands that would gather seasonally, just to give a sense of the size, seasonally at Utah Lake, what I call Timpanogos Lake, named after the band, and what they call Timpanogos Lake, and maybe one day we'll call Timpanogos Lake again. So he was a member of that band that was lived by or close to the water there, but seasonally the various Utes, perhaps also I would argue most likely Colorado Utes with whom they traded, and Dene people, others would come and gather on these festival grounds. It's like Coachella, of pre-settler era, and there are tens of thousands of people that would gather. So the Utes were 10 to 20,000 people strong, and they lived in little bands, dozen families or so that would gather seasonally. And so the Utes, though, just kind of points of importance. The Utes were most likely the first native people to get the horse. And they introduced, I'm pretty confident to say they introduced Comanche, another Shoshone, right, community, to the horse and horse culture. There's been such great work on the spread of the horses and horse culture, outside of like a part separate from the Spanish spreading, right? Will Taylor, my fellow Carleton College graduate, who's the University of Boulder professor, his fantastic work on horses, and to show that the horses really were spread widely pre-19 or 1680, when we usually cite the Pueblo Revolt as the mass reintroduction of the horses. So they were a horse people, right? Especially the Timpanogos Utes. But they were also a fish people. Before they were horse people, they were a fish people, the Timpanogos Utes in particular, and they gather seasonally, and that's the first part of the book, gather seasonally at Utah Lake to participate in these spawning seasons, or fish festival during the spawning seasons. And Utah Lake, Timpanogos Lake, had 13 endemic species, 13 native species, and it was the richest fishery in the Great Basin, no question. And part of the argument I make in this book is, and also to kind of push back against this idea of the ecological Indian, that the Indian is just like part of nature, right? They were resource managers and managing the fish, making sure they could get enough from the fish every season, but making sure they wouldn't overfish. And obviously that's different from how the settler, especially the Mormons, came to see that resource. So they were a fish people who became a horse people and a horse nation, again, to kind of borrow the language of some of the great work on Native nations by Kathleen Duvall and others. I would argue, careful with this language, but Wakara was part of an empire, different kind of empire, a native empire that was had a home base, right? That's a really key part of empires, to have a home base and spread, but return. I would think that one is the one way we can differentiate between native empires and kind of settler empires. So fish people, horse people, traders with all, even up to the Great Plains, down in New Mexico, out into California, incredibly rich culture. But part of the reason we don't know as much about the Utes of Utah Lake, and we'll get to this, is that they were so strong they became the clearest target for the Latter-day Saints, the settlers who come to eradicate them, to exterminate them, and that's the language that was used, because they occupied, they governed, they managed the most important resource that the Latter-day Saints had their heart set on. So that's the kind of a story of the kind of Western Utes.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating story too, Max, because Ute territory itself expands most of Utah, most of Colorado into New Mexico. I mean, it is a massive swath of land that largely the Ute bands themselves controlled. And of course, they had differing relationships with one another as they continue to do so. But I have to tell you, I went down to BYU a couple years ago. Actually, it was 2023. I think right after I met you, and was invited by some friends of mine on the faculty there, and got to see that landscape for the first time. And all I thought was, Max, did you write this book so you could do research there? Because that is some of the most beautiful country you're just ever going to run into. It is insanely gorgeous there.
Well, I joke that my real religion is skiing, which is not. I go to Utah. So I can go skiing. I always joke that the archives go bad if you don't go in February and March. It is beautiful, beautiful land. And, what your impression had, especially of Utah Lake, and ironically, a lot of people from Utah Lake area, what we call the Utah Valley or Utah County, don't have that impression of the lake, right. In part because of the environmental degradation that has occurred, the algae blooms, the massive amount of carp that are now in the lake, and perhaps we'll save the story of the restoration of the lake, the rebirth of the lake towards the end. But it was, John C. Fremont, Dominguez and Escalante, so many people.
All these just are going through here.
They're all going through it, and they're all saying the same thing. This is the most beautiful place I've ever seen. Let's build a, either Mexican or American huge colony here. Right. Huge settlement, and it can support. Dominguez and Escalante came up in 1776 looking for a route from New Mexico to the newly established missions in California, and they come through the Utah Valley, and they say this place could house the biggest outpost or community settlement in Mexico, and as big as Mexico City. And they weren't wrong. I mean, that's all the growth in Utah County, which is, in some ways a problem. Not some ways, in a lot of ways a problem. Speaks to that rich area.
Yeah, you can see why, regardless of your faith or anything like that, you could come down and look at that. Let's go. This has to be the direct work of some creator because it's so incredibly beautiful. So certainly, Utes would say creator made the space for. One of the things I think people don't know this: Utes don't have a migration story. Utes are like, this is home. This is just, we came here, and this is it.
Yes.
And you get that, while you're there.
Yeah, that's part of the origin story, right? Their god Sinov gave them. Set the land apart for them.
Yeah.
Right? I contrast that with the Latter-day Saints, who's also had kind of a belief that their understanding of God gave them that space. Set them apart, but it's a different kind of relationship. Instead of domination or, over that land and extraction, they say it was designed to be shared, right? And they were stewards of the land, saw themselves as such.
How convenient for them that they arrived there, but that's the pessimistic. I don't want to pick too much. I'll get in trouble with my buddies back in Provo, but it does kind of key in on a big push that you're making here, which is early on in the book. You're talking about manifest destiny, and you're really saying, hey, for the longest time we've been told that manifest destiny was a success. Mm-hmm. These processes happened, they took place, and they were successful. And you're kind of flipping the switch here, saying, no, maybe not so much. Do you want to talk a little bit about this idea that maybe manifest destiny wasn't the success that we've been taught that it was?
Yeah. I mean. I say it's the most pernicious myth, right?
Yeah.
The most pernicious myths of manifest destiny, the most dangerous myth, is that it succeeded, right? Because the idea of manifest destiny, right, is that God had set aside this space, the Americas, for Christian domination, Catholic domination, later Protestant domination, but certainly European domination. And it was a given, a teleology, preordained that these Christian settlers would come, and part of the process, right? It wasn't that the land was empty, that it was actually occupied, and part of the process was removing native peoples from the land. That was part of it. And we are taught that, as I call it, it's the first article of faith of the American gospel, is that manifest destiny succeeded. But it depends on where you live in America, where you come in more contact with living, breathing Native Americans, or presence of native culture on the land. It depends on where you are. But a lot of Americans are taught this as, again, an origin story, as an article of faith, that it succeeded. And what that does is that it denies when they come in contact, when settlers like myself come in contact with native people and native culture, they think of native culture as a relic, right, of the past, and they reduce it to the past, and they see native living and breathing native peoples as my main youth mentor, Forrest Kutch, who's a direct descendant of Wakara, says. It's like Jurassic Park, like they were created out of some, the ember, or we're ghosts, right? Which the haunting of America is a well-established or a well-studied idea of the haunting of settler America by Native Americans. So they have to shout, as I articulate, against that cacophony of messages of manifest destiny, of national parks messages, public school curriculum, national holidays that all celebrate manifest destiny success, and they have to shout, "We're still here!" Right? Perhaps the most, one of the main refrains of Indian country. And of course, Indian country can be reservations, can be American cities. All of America is Indian country, but we're still here, is what I hear. And especially directed at settlers myself, they have to, prove their existence. And so again, that's why it's pernicious myth, right? A dangerous myth. And it denies Native people's place, including Wakara's descendants, in an active, constructive way in American culture today. And so that's what I'm trying to point out. The erasure of Wakara and his people, right? Purposeful erasure, and the failure of it, or at least it's a seasonal success. And it's you people, like a lot of Native people, think of, instead of history as a linear progress, a teleology, it's a seasonal process. It's a long season, right, of diaspora, but returning Wakara all the ways to his homeland is, I think, what I'm observing, perhaps wishing for too, but what I'm observing now.
I actually want to interrupt for a second, because you brought up Forrest Kutch, who I think I got a chance to meet in Tallahassee a couple of years ago as well. I believe he's with
yes,
right?
He came down. Yes, of course.
Lovely man. But I'm wondering, I want to get to the idea here about the work and the writing for a second, because Max, you're a white dude.
Yep.
And you're writing Native history. And there has been a lot of pushback inside of certain circles saying, hey, this should only be by these people. And this isn't exclusive to Native history. A lot of different fields go through these fits and throws and stuff like that, whether it's women's history, African history, whatever. I'm not trying to single out Native history or anything like that. But you are coming from the outside. And here's the question I've got for you. What was your experience like, as far as saying, hey, you obviously, and you talk about this in the book, I do recognize I'm not Ute. I'm not Native. I'm trying to tell these stories, and I'm trying to do so in a really ethical way. But what was it like? What was it like for you reaching out to Ute tribal members? Did you find pushback? Was it complete acceptance? What was that process for you as a non-Native scholar doing Native history?
Well, Forrest has what from the beginning, and he has an interesting place because he's worked with settlers in a lot of ways. He's a former head of Indian Affairs for the state of Utah. He's well practiced at communicating with settler descendants like myself. But yes, it took a long time to build up trust. Certainly with Forrest, certainly with his family, with his extended family, with the Ute tribal members, not just Ute tribal members, but Paiute tribal members. The Paiutes are the people on whom Wakara mostly preyed for slaving, but Wakara has a lot of descendants also among the Paiutes. I'll give an example of my dear friend Rick and Rena Pickavett, who are elders with the Kanash band of Paiutes. When they first met me, they told me, "Do not write this book." They said also that Wakara didn't participate in slavery, right? They just didn't. They had met so many experiences, completely understandable, where settlers like myself come, do history work, extract from them stories, publish it in their books, and don't do any continue to have reciprocal relationships. And I completely understand that. And so yes, it took, after that first meeting, it took many other meetings for Rick and Rena and I to debate. Like when I said slavery, they meant, and perhaps we'll talk about this later, but like slavery meant a different thing. To them, that it meant, when they heard slavery coming out of my mouth, they associated with chattel slavery, right? We still operate in the black-white binary of that North-South experience. And Wakara slavery bondage was very different than kind of chattel slavery and settler slavery. And that's one of the main parts I do, is differentiate between settler Indian slavery and Native Indian slavery. It took a long time to build up trust, and that's an ongoing process. The book is published. I'm on the kind of travel circuit with Forrest, the big event that we had in the University of Utah, home of the Utes, right? The Seminole, have a relationship with the Ute Indian tribe of Utah, so they can use the mascot, and it's a really big point of pride. And Forrest's family has been directly involved in negotiating that relationship. So it continues, right? I have ethical responsibilities to continue. Like any descendant wants the book, we'll have a free copy, right? All the work that I've done in building up Wakara's really complicated family tree, it's private tree, like on Ancestry, but I welcome descendants to come and look at it. I mean, that's their tree. So it's a continual process and continuation. And Forrest and I are going to do some events in Colorado coming up in early February. We're going to be in Boulder and then at Steamboat, the 4th and the 5th.
I will absolutely come up to see you if you like. Heck yeah. I'd love to see him again regardless. I can definitely make Boulder. Boulder's a few hours, and they've got that Boulder bookstore on Pearl Street, which is just, have you been there?
I haven't, but I hope, I think they're the ones who are going to bring the books. It's going to be at the university. Again, you territory up there telling that story. But all I can do is write from my own perspective, right? Totally. And I think one of the things we can learn from Indigenous peoples is that this is a given. When Indigenous people meet other people they don't know, they tell who and where they're from, and who and where are actually the same thing.
Yeah,
that's the Indigenous identity. Who and where are the same thing. I'm from here. These are my people, right? That's kind of at its most basic, an Indigenous relationship, or people from land and from people, and that's one and the same. And so, but I'm also an American. My story is different, but as I say, I'm implicated in the story, and I've learned this from Indigenous methodologies. Margaret Kovach's wonderful book on Indigenous methodologies, that I am implicated in the story, and I need to not lead with that, to recenter myself, but recognize that. And my invitation to descendant settlers like myself, is not to feel bad about the fact that, yes, my place in America was in part built on spilled Indian blood and stolen Indian land. And I, a little bit in the book, talk about my ancestry and how that's true. Instead of self-flagellating, about that, which just again recenters my trauma, my experience.
Makes it about you. When you do that, right?
Instead, I know better now, unlike my ancestors. Maybe they should have known better, certainly. I know better now. And so what is, as an American, Forrest is an American. I'm an American. There's no place to go send me back to, Swedish, German. I'm Swedish, German. This is my homeland too. It's a different kind of relationship. But what does that mean now? And we can have a better and different relationship in the present. And so when I'm inviting settlers to, not feel shame, but understand they have a responsibility and feel implicated. And that leads them to, perhaps I invite them to think about ethical decision making, about the relationships to the land they owned, right, which is often the storehouse of our generational wealth. That was a long way of saying your question, but it's about, like all things in life, I would argue, but in particular, indigenous communities, it's about relationships and maintaining those relationships.
Thank you. Thank you so very much for saying. You were saying these words, Max, and I'm trying not to sit here and just like fist pump the whole time, because I just absolutely buy in on everything you're telling me. I would always tell people, I was like, look, I don't want you to feel bad. You're not guilty. You didn't do this stuff, but you are responsible. And by that, I mean, you're responsible for learning from it so we can all move forward, right? That's the kicker here. To hear you say that in those terms, it feels good,
I wanted people to be empowered, right?
Totally.
Like empowered. Now, this stuff, you get to decide what you're going to do. My, one of the mentors, and Forrest's cousin, Larry Sesbuck, who's the most prominent spiritual leader of the youth, the Northern Youths. He talks about, he says that we are the ancestors aren't just always with us, right? Which is a basic concept in, indigenous people. We are the ancestors. And he means that in some ways, an embodied way. Now, yes, we are our own selves, but we are in the embodiment of our ancestors. And Larry will actually point to Forrest, his cousin. He says he is in Tonga, which is a great youth leader, most likely a nephew of Wakara, who, like Forrest, was a fierce defender of native sovereignty, who led an uprising against the native, against the settlers, but also tried to negotiate ways of living on the land, like Forrest has in his own way. So he's the embodiment of Ntonga, and that means I can be in the embodiment of my ancestor and make different decisions than they did in the past.
Yeah, I'll tell you, my own experience is that it's weird because I've never once felt any kind of pushback at all when I go to the res to go visit with tribal members, whether I'm out in Ute country or I'm up in Comanche land or wherever. People are like, "You're welcome here." It's always been, and maybe that's because I had done the work to say, "Hey, I'm just here for whatever for whatever you need" and stuff like that. But I don't feel like that's necessarily even a native thing so much as that's a community thing. You go to my hometown in Murray, people are going to look at you sideways until you go and sit down and have biscuits and gravy with them.
That's
right. It's about meeting people where they are.
Mm-hmm. And recognizing you're going to mess up and
totally. Being humble about it.
Yeah, and yes, I remember the one. This is very embarrassing now, but I remember during what it was either a bear dance or the pre-4th of July service, I walked across the dance circle.
No,
I was and I just was so excited to see a friend, and it was early. No one was there, but folks came up to me. The dance leader, the drum leader, and he came. Hey, just next time, and he walked this way, and I felt horrible, but he just it's totally fine. And when we're crossing these barriers, I brought my students just yesterday. I teach a big Jesus class on the Jesus, and the last part of the class is we go to two different churches who have very different representations of Jesus in their sanctuaries. And one of the church we went to yesterday is a very small AME church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. And students, that's scary for a lot of students who have not scary as they feel unsafe, but scary when they're crossing that threshold. But once you do and realize, as the lay leader of the church said to us, please come back on Sunday. I think that is the almost almost always the predominant message is of welcome, as long as you come with the spirit of welcome.
Have you danced at bear dance?
Yes, I have. Yep, I've. Bear dance is they call it the Sadie Hawkins dance. It's girls and women choose.
It's so much fun.
And so, you men are sitting there, and then, on the bench, and then the women come from different ages and come grab you. And, I bought myself a pair of gloves because your hands get pretty sweaty. But it's great. It's great fun. Yeah.
I got yelled at my first time that I went to bear dance. This is on the Southern Ute Reservation. And my very dear friend, Casey Atencio, who is former TIPA director, I love her so much. She calls me Uncle Jason. And I was really shy, Max, about going. I was like, I'm not gonna. She's like, you said you want to learn our culture. Get your ass in the crowd and dance. Yes, Casey. And then you do it, and you're like, this weird magic happens. Because you realize I'm doing the work, right? But I'm also like part of this community. Now to like this small little thing. I just light up every time I talk about it, because like all I want to do. But the thing is, like, Max, when I go there, I'm usually one of the only white guys there. Usually the other white guys I recognize because they work for the tribe. So it's like it's I feel good that I'm there, but I'm also like, man, I wish I could get other people from outside the community to come and share and see and feel this.
Yes.
I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. I. We have right here in Lincoln. We have the Indian Center, and they host. And on our campus, we have a Native group, and I've good old powwows seasonally, and they're often. It's attended by community members, Native community members. But I think when settler descendant folk come, it does. There is something. One has to be careful here, but a little bit. One feels a connection with community and sees the beauty, and it's confusing. Like the singing isn't the kind of singing that the rhythms aren't my rhythms, but if you let yourself kind of experience it, I think there's some great learning that happens, and then you recognize, hey, these people, and how very that's one of the things I'll also say, how very American they are.
Yeah, totally.
Right. Like the bear dance, or if you go to a powwow and if you see the procession coming in,
so much fun.
The first thing you see is the pride. This is why Wakara, to me, I kind of joke. I was talking about Jesus. Jesus is understood by most Christians as fully divine and fully human. Well, Wakara, in some ways, he's a complicated figure. As Rena Pikovich said, a great man, but not a good one necessarily. She, which I think is fair, she's a fully human person, like a Brigham Young or a Juan Sarah, who are trying to
like anybody else.
And he just had a bigger role, bigger presence. And anyway, I think of Wakara as fully American and fully like participating in settler America, right? He's like both of these things, Native American and kind of settler American. Well, if you go to any powwow, the first thing you see is the procession of veterans, Native veterans, with the American flag and the feather and the tribal flags. The honor that Native people have for defending the nation. The biggest monument on the Northern Ute Reservation is a statue as a memorial to the veterans, and the biggest statue. And I kind of see Wakara there. He's this leader on a horse. So the pride of defending America, even when, as they say on that memorial, America didn't want us, right? We are defending our homeland, and America is our homeland. I was worried about calling it America because of, there are other books, Blank America, that have been out recently. But, Wakara helped create America, as we've talked about a little bit, but it is also his land, right? He probably wouldn't have used that word, but America is his homeland, and he helped create it.
All right. So one of the things I find fascinating. Do you know James Brooks' work at all? Are you familiar with
yes,
right? Right. Of course.
Yes.
Okay. So in my mind, he's known as Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's how I imagine. James is a friend. He's a buddy of mine, and he got me into fly fishing out here. No, he's cost me a lot of money. Him and Brett Rushforth actually have cost me a ton of money getting into the passion, the pursuit of this stuff. And so I open up this book, and there's this chapter on this lake and the relationship to fish. And so much of this hit me really close to home, Max, because of my time working with Seminole tribal members, questions over management of the Everglades all the way to this day. Tribal members are leading, Seminole, especially Miccosukee now, are leading this charge to kind of restore waterways, pushing back on pollution, invasive species. And I'm not just talking about people from Jersey. I'm talking about, whatever. But so can we talk a little bit about environmental stewardship? Because certainly in my own line of work, I should probably slide in here at some point in time. This podcast is not brought to you by the Forest Service, but can we talk a little bit about Timpanogos environmental stewardship, how that changes regarding the lake as far as when the Mormons come in? I don't want to put the Mormons as a big bad story here, but like what changes, and then where we are now when it comes to like this environmental story here.
Yeah. So as we said before, part of it's hard. Some of the work I had to do was figure out. I had some resources. So an ethnologist, anthropologist, went and visited the Northern Utes in the 1930s and talked to Wakara's grandchildren. And so they remembered at least stories of fish management at the lake. And then I also looked at how I used some fish management studies from the Northwest, different kind of fish managers, to kind of piece together how they were managing. But yeah, they're managing this fishery, making sure, they're most likely selecting for sex. So they're harvesting the older males, letting the younger females go because they can produce more eggs. An older male can help. What's the word I'm looking for?
Fertilize.
Yes, fertilize. Thank you.
I was going to say Marvin Gaye, they could set the record player on.
I used to joke that when I was first working on this book, I was like watching all these spawning videos of like fish porn. I was like really into fish porn. Anyway, so they're using weirs, right? They're caring for the land, caring for the fish. They're making sure, and the specially trained folks, right? Fish captains might use the word fish chiefs, who are specially trained, have the traditional ecological knowledge, trial and error, passed down over generations, right? So important to managing the fishery. And then the settlers come in, the Mormons come in, and just backing up a little bit. When I say he's the founding father of the American West, here's one that a lot of the Utah folks I like to use with. But one of the founding stories of Mormon Utah, right? Origin story is when Brigham Young and the Vanguard Company enters the valley in 1847 on July 24th, 1847. And I'm with Mormon audiences. I can say, what did he say about the valley? He said, this is the place. This is the place that God had set apart to make saints, which is almost certainly apocryphal. He kind of remembered having said that, but
sounds like David Byrne and the Talking Heads. But go on.
Yes, well, I'm a big Talking Heads fan. This pronouncement that God had set apart. Well, and he's talking about the Salt Lake Valley. Well, the reason why they located this, the center of Mormonism in Salt Lake Valley, they had wanted to go down to Utah Lake, Timpanogos Lake, because that's where all the water is. That's where all the fish are, right? Just before entering the Salt Lake Valley, just a few days before, they were up with Jim Bridger at his Southern Wyoming outpost, and they were going to Utah Lake based on that map that they had from John C. Fremont that Wakara helped build. So kind of the amazing circles. But Jim Bridger said, you want to go to Utah Lake? I wouldn't go down there, right? Now, he doesn't say Wakara, truthfully. The records don't say that. But he says, they will run you away. They're a band of, skin and bone pioneers after that huge trek across Nebraska and Wyoming, barely alive. If you go down there, they will run you out. They will kill you, if not they will run you out, if not kill you. So, and that's Wakara's homeland. And Jim Bridger knew Wakara very well. He had traded with them. I think he's referring to Wakara in particular. And so Brigham Young changes his mind. Instead of Provo, the center of what is now Provo, the center of Mormon Kingdom, although BYU is probably more Mormon than Salt Lake now, but where Temple Square is located, the center stake of Zion is in Salt Lake City. Why? Not because God told him, Brigham Young, to put it there, because Wakara told him through Jim Bridger. So even that, right, how important he is on the creation of the American West, the cartography of the American West is just one example. So, but the settlers were not, because they didn't have that traditional ecological knowledge. They were New Englanders, Old Englanders, etc. They tried to plant their crops as they would do in New England and Old England, and they didn't take to the environment of central Utah. And so there were mass starvations, mass bug infestations, and so they had to fish, and they overfished. They didn't understand, well, first, they had just a different relationship to the land. Instead of making sure that there were enough fish for future generations of fish, which meant future generations of human, their idea was to maximize the output or the extraction for right now so they could expand the kingdom or expand the population, not worrying about the future, right? They're not worried, they didn't know, and I don't think they could care, and perhaps they didn't even care or understand that was a limited supply. And so they overfished, and they changed irrigation. This beautiful braided estuaries and spawning places. They built bulldozed to make not bulldozed, but cut up with irrigation to make their farmlands. They eventually put the Provo River into one channel, which meant that all the spawning couldn't happen. And so the 13 endemic species were destroyed. They introduced carp, and now there are only 2 endemic species in the lake. But recently, inspired and sometimes working directly with Wakara's tribal descendants, they are realizing that if we want to make the lake more livable and attractive to humans, instead of thinking about what's good for humans, if they focus on a particular fish, and in this case, the June sucker is an indicator species. The health of the June sucker indicates the whole health of the ecosystem. And over the last 40 years, they're trying to reintroduce this June sucker, removing the one channel of the Provo River, recreating the braided spawning areas. And so this, again, remember that seasonal history, the diaspora and return of the fish. So Wakara's fish, I kind of argue towards the end of the book, are coming back through a collaboration between settlers, right? BYU professors and local people and local officials, almost all of them are Latter-day Saints, and inspired at least by some of Wakara's ancestors, how they understood the land.
Yeah, and I think that here's the cool thing as you're talking about that, right? Which is to reinforce that these relationships, which are sometimes good, sometimes bad, in the long array of things, we have the opportunity to do real work together, right? And just to hear, and certainly this is not only the case in Utah. We see the Pacific Northwest.
Yes.
I've had a chance to do some work with the Umatilla Reservation as well, talking about one of the Pacific Northwest groups, and seeing these groups do this. It's one of those feel good moments that we can legitimately say this is how we move forward. It's like, so sitting that chapter on this is so. Frankly, it's kind of heartwarming, which you don't get a lot in history books, Max.
Yeah. A way forward.
Yeah. Speaking of heartwarming, let's talk about slavery. Indigenous slavery, and I felt a lot of Resendez in here when I was reading, and so forth. Right. A lot of Duvall in your book as I'm reading, but can we talk a little bit about indigenous slavery in Utah? When you talk about Wakara being a slaver, an enslaver of humans, what does that mean in 1840s Utah? How is that different than, say, that white-black binary you were talking about earlier?
Yeah, and so this is based on Andres Resendez's wonderful work and others. James Brooks, Captains and Cousins, thinking through those issues and kind of applying their frames to what we can observe in the situation with Wakara and then settlers. in New Mexico, California, and then, of course, the Latter-day Saints in Utah. And so, here's what I try to extend kind of Andres's work. And I'm very glad that Andres and Kathleen blurbed the book.
You've got some hitters on the back of this book.
Yes. I was very, 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 very honored. Of course, Ned's work too, in terms of Ned Blackhawk's work, in terms of violence, is just violence.
Some guy named Deloria on the back. Yeah, whatever.
Yep. And I'm going to be hanging out with Philip Deloria at Harvard Bookstore in a few weeks. Actually, next week, to talk about this book. I'm very grateful to their.
You're going on tour, sir.
Yeah, a little bit. I'm trying to. So here's one of the differences. As Andres Resines points out in his wonderful book, the seminal book, the most comprehensive book on Indian slavery, The Other Slavery, he shows that first a couple of things. Indian slavery, and we'll use that word for now, existed long before settlers came, and even long after chattel slavery officially ended in the Americas, and particularly where I focus on the American Southwest. But it was a different kind of slavery than the settler Indian slavery that came. So I'll just point out probably what he found in his terrific work was the first time the Utes are on record enslaved, the Ute people, Wakara's people, through raiding of New Mexicans in the 1600s and 1700s probably. They were taken from their homelands. This is what remember extraction. Settlers, this is overly simplistic, but settlers believe in extraction and profit making. And that serves two purposes, both to make profit, but also to remove native peoples from the land so that settlers can come in. So they take, from the Pueblos, from the Utes, from the, Apache, they're taking people and sending them south to the silver mines. And that's one of the great things that Andres does in that book, to show, the gold mines, the gold rush we think of, the silver rush was such a more important rush in terms of the creation of wealth, the creation of a first not international, coin of the realm, which was, Spanish silver, international trading. Anyway, so what do? They de-tribalize. Remember, native peoples are people from whom, and from where. They de-tribalize. They take people away from their homelands, and so they're disconnected from the land to extract and people. And so they're extracting from homeland the people and extracting labor, and move them across large distances to do work. And that's kind of similar, fairly similar to the African, the Middle Passage, de-tribalizing, connecting people from Africa, across the Middle Passage to the Americas. Settler Indian slavery that I observed through Wakara it can be as brutal, extractive, but in the end, settler Indian slavery is about bonding again people to the land and people to people. And so for Wakara, he is certainly, when he's going and enslaving the Paiutes, yes, he sells them on both ends of the Old Spanish Trail, for horses, for trade goods, for cash sometimes. But there are times, again, using James Brooks's work, that he would capture a young child or a young girl. That young child might become his child, an adopted child, or that young girl might become his wife. Most likely, some of Wakara's wives were Paiute. That's why of origin. That's why many of them, went back to live with the Paiutes after Wakara's death. He might have a child like he did with Kanash, and Kanash, the Ute leader I talk a lot about, who lived very closely to the Mormons. He made a different choice to live very close to the Mormons. That meant that all his direct descendants died off of disease, all of them. Ironically, the only child of Kanash's that survived to have his own children was this man named John Kanash, who had started life. He was given to Kanash by Wakara as a child. So he started life as a slave or a captive, better word. So again, Wakara, and this is true, and I would argue this is true with the, in Mexico and other places, bondage can be brutal. It often is. Captivity, right? you might raid another tribe, and you might kill off a lot of people, but the people you make captives might get folded into your community over time. That's certainly what James is talking about, and often gender plays a key role in it. Right? The captives are most often young and most often female. Wakara does the same work with the Mormons when they come. Right? When the Mormons come, Wakara is like, yes, more people I can sell my slaves and horses to. And he helps direct the settlements, including the first settlements outside of the Utah Valley, the Wasatch Front, so from Salt Lake down to Provo. He directs them, say, you go settle there, you go settle there, you go settle there. He sometimes brings them up to help participate in the settlement. He really is a founder of a lot of these towns. And in one of the towns called Manti, in the Sandpitch Valley, he lived in 1849 to 1850, helped it get started. And he, through the work that we did through genealogy and DNA, we proved that he placed his own children, his own daughters, in the settlers' households, expecting that he would get children back, right? So captives can become kin. He did that because he wanted to create family relationships with the Mormons, like the great patriarchs and matriarchs of like Europe, placing you marry my daughter, my son will marry your daughter, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll be less likely to fight and more likely to trade and share land. So Wakara, again, is trying to, he also uses the Mormons to like displace his rivals and go down there, and which was not his land to give away, and they'll drive off his rivals. So, but that's the difference between settler Indian slavery and Native Indian slavery. Native Indian slavery, again, can be as brutal as any other, but it helps to bond people to land, and that's the key. That's the key difference.
So one of the first things that I've been talking up your book for a couple of weeks now as I've been reading it. I try, I try to be that rare podcast host that actually reads the book, which means I have no free time because I have so much stuff on my desk right now. And it's a good problem.
Yeah.
Especially when I got to read this thing, because I was so giddy for this to show up.
Thank you.
Like,
appreciate it.
I had a hard time. I still haven't been able to mark this thing up. It's too damn pretty. I have all these notes in my notebook. That's a story for another day.
I'll send you another copy that you can.
No, you're going to sign this one when I come see you in Boulder in February. But when I talk about this book and I start explaining who this dude was, now that I know him, right, a little bit.
Yep.
Like, what do you mean he's a Mormon? Right? And that is like this big thing that's completely surprises people, this relationship. He converts to Mormonism. Can we talk about this? Always turns heads, like maybe just outside Utah, but Ute folks, a lot of Ute folk converted to Mormonism. Wakara certainly did. Can we talk about that, but also this on off, or this relationship with Brigham Young and this war that happens as a result?
Yeah, so that's a great. The idea of conversion. I will use that word. I hope I don't. He is baptized and he is ordained into Mormon elder. And again, it's very similar idea, I believe. So the Mormons thought that community I was just talking about, Manti, where he placed his two children, he was also baptized. Wakara is a founder of Manti, founder of a lot of the settlements in indirect or direct settlements up in that valley. In March 1850, Wakara is baptized. He then later leads most of his followers into the baptismal waters. And boy, are the Mormons excited, because without going too far into like Mormon theology, like key aspect of early Mormon theology is converting Native Americans. That they saw that as their one of their primary charges. And white Mormons and Native Americans would come together and build a new Jerusalem to await Christ's return. That was the idea, one of the key ideas. And so they're so excited. Wakara, and they've had a hard time converting Native Americans to this point. Wakara is joining us, and then later he's baptized a year later, and he and a few other leaders are ordained. And in Mormonism, priesthood is held by all men, basically, including young boys. Almost all men. That's it. We can talk about the history of African people in the Mormon Church another time. But so the Mormons think of this as him like throwing off, abandoning his spirituality, his worldview, native worldview, and accepting theirs completely. How we would understand conversion, right? If I convert to a religion, I'm giving up my old one, joining another. That's kind of how we understand conversion. Based on the work of Lynn Fisher, my dear friend Lynn Fisher, who studied native conversions, he calls it affiliation. And I think that's a much better way of putting it, right? He's not getting rid of his native spirituality or native identity. He's adding to it. It's additive. And so the Mormons see it one way, he sees it another. And that also leads to like why the Mormons thought that, oh, we can control you now. You're one of our people. But yes, I mean, it's interesting when Wakara has talked about it, he barely does it. As he mentioned that he does affiliate, or we can just be, he's baptized and ordained, we can use the terminology of it. When I was talking with one of the leaders of the church who used to run the history department a few years ago, a great and good man, Rick Turley, but I was telling him, oh, we know where Wakara is. He's out there in Smithsonian. And I was saying, it's interesting to think of like how they think of him and his Mormonness. If that had been like a pioneer, like the equivalent of him, which that would be like an apostle. I mean, Wakara, like, if his skull, an apostle's skull, was at the Smithsonian, they would have gotten it a long time ago. So it's interesting to think about, like, do they really think of him as a Mormon? So that's part of the conversion story. And Wakara, though, because he affiliates, he doesn't like, yes, Brigham, you are now my prophet. He sees himself always as Brigham's equal. And they're always negotiating back and forth, land use, fishing rights, slavery, etc. And for a while after that baptism, the Mormons actually give kind of the equivalent of traveling papers. We've been talking about like the black-white binary. Like they write him a note that he shows to settlers, like, you please, this is a good man. Trade in your slaves and your horses with him. Trade your Paiute children and horses with this man. So they see him as part of like an extension, a partner in their expansion of their Mormon kingdom. And including that is the Mormon idea of bringing Native peoples into their communities. Again, the theology of Native Americans becoming Mormon, and then, and to use the most infamous part of the Book of Mormon, become white and delightsome. Actually, when Wakara was baptized, a settler who witnessed the baptism said, Wakara, who was described as tawny-skinned, emerged from the baptism waters, and the settler said he was as white as me. So that whitening is like figurative, but also in some ways literal. Yeah. The whitening for Mormons was we'd adopt children, right? Slavery was how they'd get rid of them. Women and children from the land, remove them and bring them into the fold. War was the way they'd get rid of men, and that was explicit in the idea, the policies of the early leaders. So the Mormons Brigham Young taught the Mormons, buy up all the Native children as fast as you can, right, and make them Mormon. Either children to work in the fields, but also to be, adopted children, although we'll see how much, it's interesting to see how much they were adopted, or become wives, and through, having children with the leaders, like they become white and delightsome people. The way the Walker War is told, and that's the war that we can talk about, is told, is that Wakara, his anglicized name is Wakara, was so upset by the fact that the Mormons were trying to stop his slave trade, although they're really trying to take it over, not stop it, that he went to war against the Mormons. Well, two things are true. It's really the fight was about land use, like about the fish, as much as it was about slavery, if not more, right? It's native sovereignty. And second thing, Wakara barely participated at all in the war. And what I try to point out, two things, right? Brigham's idea and the Mormons' idea was they didn't actually see a place for Native peoples as Native peoples to live alongside them in Mormon Utah. if Native peoples were to continue, they were only going to be part of the Mormon world, right? They weren't going to be independent or have their own Native identities. So slavery, buying children, buying wives, and then raising them up to be Mormon was the way they detribalized women and children. War was the way they wiped out most of the men, and that was the explicit policy of Brigham. And it's named after the Wakara War. There's a skirmish over fish, which is pretty interesting. Some of Wakara's people tried to trade fish with another settler family, and there's a fight about how much flour they were getting exchanged, and it led to a violent skirmish, and that sparked kind of a cycle of revenge from 1853 to 1854. And that was known as the Walker War. But Brigham saw that opportunity and said, it's Walker's fault. And he starts calling it the Walker War. He blames Walker. Wakara is he's like, I don't want to have anything to do with this. He's not involved. But that goes to the long history that Brigham's own ancestor, I forget how many I think it's 5 great-grandfathers back, participated in the founding moment of America. Again, my interest in founding stories. And the King Philip's War, right, one of the first Indian wars that America, or the colonists participated, really helping make America. There was it started a ritual of when there's a fight between natives and settlers, the settlers would name the war after the natives and blaming them as the aggressors, right? Because they had the means of production of history, right? They could literally write on paper describing who was a savage, who was a Christian, who was at fault, who wasn't, who was an innocent, right, etc. They could describe the war, and they named the wars after the supposed Indian aggressors. And I don't think that's meaningless. I think the naming is really powerful, and it stuck. King Philip's War, the Cherokee Wars, all the war, Tecumseh's War. It's settlers or the natives are but defending their land almost always. But they're blamed for that defense. And so, that's how, and so Wakara, and it's so interesting to follow in the archives how quickly Brigham is blaming Wakara and how the national press is picking it up and calling it a Walker War. And that has stuck. So if anyone knows anything about, in grade school, in 4th grade in Utah, part of Utah history, they learn about Walker, and the only thing learned is this Walker War, seeing him as the aggressor. When, again, A, it's pretty clear he barely participated, and B, it was Brigham who, and I call it Brigham's War, right? Renaming it Brigham's War, because he's really responsible for that war and carrying out.
There's an ongoing conflict regarding Wakara.
Yeah.
And you pointed this earlier, his remains are at the Smithsonian. Can we talk a little bit about the odd circumstances around his death?
Yeah.
And then also this continuing fight to get him back home to homelands, because this, as I understand it, my own experience is this is still a form of violence on the tribes, on the part of the federal government, on the part of a lot of these universities and things like that, because they are quite literally holding ancestors against the will of indigenous people. Can we talk about where you talk about repatriation, but also this other concept of rematriation? A lot of our listeners aren't going to be familiar with NAGPRA or things like that. Can we talk a little bit about where we are in this fight to get this man home?
Yeah. I'll save some of the drama of.
Please. I don't want to give the entire book away, but
exactly. But yes, I can talk about rematriation and repatriation.
Please.
But yes, Wakara was stolen. He has this in 1855 under mysterious circumstances related to Brigham's War. Some people think he was poisoned. Brigham, I'll let you read the book, but Brigham. There is some circumstantial evidence for that possibility. And certainly the Utes, Wakara's descendants, thought that Brigham was responsible. Most likely he died of, a communicable disease. So indirectly, the Mormons are responsible. Lots and lots of, violence through war, through enslavement, but also through disease helped, wipe out large numbers of the Ute and other Utah Native. So yes, Wakara dies under mysterious circumstances in 1855. I obfuscate where the burial site is. It's readily available online, but I'm just not going to direct people to that spot. That was something we negotiated. I worked very closely with the Paiute tribe, whose land is closest to the Forest Service land. So, it's on, the burial site is currently on Forest Service land, and that'll get related to repatriation and rematriation. He dies under mysterious circumstances. He has horses killed, wives killed. He's buried with all his stuff. I describe it kind of like a pharaoh's burial.
There's some tough stuff going on with this burial. I don't want to give this away, but read the book.
Yeah, tough stuff. And I would ask you, I always think it like horrified, but also tantalized the Mormon or the.
I don't want to see this burial on screen, but
yeah, but like it reinforced like how horrible, but also it's our narrative, right?
Sure, totally.
I would ask, what is Wakara trying to do in that moment? And I argue just he's trying to preserve his world in miniature, recognizing that it's under threat, right? Anyway. It's buried in what is now a large UN Paiute burial site in south central Utah. Impossible to get to, really, unless you know where you're going. But folks did know where it was, and government agents removed not only Wakara's skull, but the skull of 6 others buried with him, and shipped them back to Smithsonian for study, right? Again, removing part of the Indian Wars wasn't just killing off live natives, but collecting crania and disrupting grave sites. And I trace how that is as old as America, like starting with the Pilgrims. Part of like collecting crania is part of the, starts with the Pilgrims. Again, founding story of America. But, repatriation. So NAGPRA and the idea of repatriation was, when NAGPRA was created, it had no input from tribes.
Right.
It's what NAGPRA was designed to solve a problem the settlers created for the settlers' purposes. It wasn't designed to help Native peoples. So what is the problem? Well, after the last 150 years or so, we've collected all this stuff. We now understand that was a bad decision. We now, and certainly influenced, I shouldn't say, without, the NAGPRA wasn't written with Native people's cooperation, but NAGPRA was encouraged, right? It was Native peoples, especially Alaskans, who helped lead that push. But it solves the settler problem, right? And what repatriation, as Stephen Newcomb, the great Native scholar of Indian law and its relationship with manifest destiny and settler law, repatriation literally means taking the remains of POWs in possession of a war, part of a war, one side of the war, and returning it to the other combatant, and returning to the land. Again, Native people are with from whom and from where. Returning it to the land. Well, that's impossible in Wakara's case, and a lot of Native people's case. Why? Because the land is still controlled by the war party, the federal government, right? So that he can't be returned. And this is part of the argument. I think land back is the solution for many of these cases. Both it proves to be better. Native peoples often prove to be better stewards of the land, and just a moral case, right, to return this land. But again, repatriation is a settler process. Rematriation, again, Stephen Newcomb and others, especially Native Indigenous women, kind of theorists and spiritual practitioners. Repatriation is patriation, right? Matriation, mother, right? Is a process that happens without settler influence that allows Native peoples to reconstitute their relationship to the land, the more than human beings, their ancestors embodied in ancestral remains, the food ways, seeds, etc. In fact, rematriation is mostly tied to seed carriers and seed keepers again, and that's a often a matrilineal practice. So, I see rematriation happening a lot. We talked about the fish. That's hopefully can be a rematriational process. Renaming land, there's been getting rid of SQAW peaks and other sites in the West, that horrible slur, calling it by native names. Again, that's a rematriation of the land, of the geography, and certainly stories and history, and also hopefully with remains not only of Wakara and his the people he was buried with, but allowing Native people to figure out what to do with these remains on their land. And so that's kind of the inspiration I take from all the folks I work with and read, Native folks, that repatriation is settler process. Rematriation is a much wholesome spiritual process apart from settler influence, and I would argue will make everyone better, settler Americans and Native Americans, because it's a healing, an act of healing, an act of justice.
I just read this amazing book of yours and just got through talking to you about this book. I've known you for a little bit now. What do you want the people to know about Wakara? Like, here's this dude that you clearly think, hey, he needs to be up here when we talk about the West. Like these mountain guys, like Hunapita Sarah, like Brigham Young, like Jeremiah, like the people who built the West, right? Yeah. What do you want them to know about Wakara?
Yeah, I love that question. What is the main takeaway? I'll go back to what Rena and Rick Pickavett said, that he was this really complicated person, who he was a great man, not a good one. But his main, what I try to do in this book is reassert his humanity. Wakara has been remembered too little and also too much. He shows up here and there in Utah kind of lore literature as this kind of literally larger than life figure. And I argue his larger than life figure-ness. Here's one tidbit. He was 5'7". We know how large he was because the Mormons measured him and weighed him. He actually had a little weight to him, relatively speaking, because he was a wealthy guy and he could eat. But in the lore literature, in the few books that kind of mythologize him, he literally grows. He goes from 5'7", and there's a piece written in the early 20th century where he's 6 foot, and then and by 1950s, he's 6'6". He literally grows a foot. So again, that's just to show he needs to be so big. So by dominating him, the Mormons can show, the settlers can show their greatness. So again, I want to get back away from that mythology and show him as a human. He's fundamentally a human who was trying to do two things: expand his own power, expand his own wealth, pass on his genes, which he was very successful at. There are lots of Native people who are, in Utah and other places who are descended from Wakara. There are a lot of people who don't even know they're descended from Wakara. And also protect his people. He wanted to protect his people. And he did that in ways that we might find objectionable, and other people in his time found objectionable. But he endures, right? He remains, and I use that word advisedly, with his remains, and in the America he helped create, in the fish that are returning, the horses that he used and helped spread, in the stories, and certainly in his people. And so that's what I wanted. That's the main takeaway. And by looking at understanding Wakara and his, I talked about his many descendants, understanding his family tree, it's really a family story, right? His knotty, Knoty family tree that is not so pretty sometimes, many branches. That's the story of often the story of America, and I want to keep that in mind. And hopefully, folks can appreciate America for its complexity, especially the American West and its complexity in this kind of long family drama.
Max, we've been talking about the past now for 90 minutes.
Yeah.
What's in the future for you? You're obviously going on tour. You're going to see approximately every bookstore in the United States. But what happens? What are you working on the next project? Are you a person who can take off, or what comes next for you?
I have the next project. I'm going to write a little book on youth, Alta, because I mentioned Alta Ski is my favorite place on earth. For my book series with the University of Utah, short book. But the next project is continues this idea of Native peoples as Americans. So it's going to be a book about the shipwreck in 1884, the shipwreck of the SS City of Columbus, which is just rich of a name, City of Columbus. It was a ship, passenger ship, steamer that went from Boston to Savannah, Georgia. It's really a post-Reconstruction story in a lot of ways, but I want to make this kind of really narrative-driven. So this ship had many classes, but actually quite wealthy people on board, traveling from Boston to Savannah. Many of them were leaving Boston to get away from the harsh winters. It was in January. This event happened, and runs aground right off of Gay Head, Aquinnah, and Martha's Vineyard on shoals called the Devil's Bridge. And it's very clear that it was a pilot's error. It happened kind of in the early morning. Well, the story is the captain and crew basically abandoned ship and leave the passengers, which were a lot of women and children, to drown. And they take off. But the Wampanoag, who had managed to keep, the Wampanoag Indians had managed to keep a portion of their land, not only on the East Coast, but on Martha's Vineyard. They were part of a proto Coast Guard outfit, and they go out and they save some people.
No kidding.
And over the next few years, the Wampanoags, this is 1884, a very important time when land allotment is trying, and other anti-Indian policies are trying to remove Native peoples from their land and even end Native identities. The argument of, one of the arguments for the book is that the Wampanoags use this heroism and chivalry to demonstrate themselves to be American and Native, right? And that their Native identity was something to be cherished, not to be, gotten rid of. And so that's one of the ways I argued that the Wampanoags were able to hold on to their land in Aquinnah, Martha's Vineyard. But really, I want it to be stories. It's really an amazing book. There are some of the Wampanoag rescuers who are members of the 54th, the Massachusetts 54th, and some of the people on board are members of the Massachusetts 54th. The Wampanoag were mixed race often, so we had famous judges and landowners who owned land in Florida. It's development of actually early Florida as a tourist location around Tallahassee. Actually, a lot of the people own land, and so they're going down to like Florida to like recoup and get the spas in Florida and other places. So that's the next project.
Sign me up, dude. I'm in. Right now. I'm ready. So, dude, thank you so much for taking the time. We've been talking forever. I couldn't stop asking you questions because I just want to talk more and more about your book, which I hope people go read. I really appreciate you taking time to do this because I just want to share these stories, especially about Ute people. This is an amazing book about this really interesting dude. So, Max, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Jason, and happy reading. It's a great dad book. So,
oh my gosh, this needs to go into the tree. Is the way? Bully, I'm gonna push the heck out of this.
Thank you, Jason.
And that's a wrap here at Reckoning with Jason Herbert. Thank you so very much to our guest, Max Perry Mueller. Max, that was an awesome conversation about this really interesting dude. Thank you so very much to our producer, Fletcher Powell, for making this show run. And most of all, thank you to all of you guys. We've got a lot of new listeners recently. Thank you for being here. Thanks for giving this a spin. If you like it, please subscribe so you can hear more. We've got a lot more podcasts coming for you shortly. And we'll see you then. Ciao for now. Bye.